isolation, insanity, and incessant waves. Welcome to the life of a Victorian lighthouse keeper, where your only friends are seagulls and your best conversation is with yourself. Picture this. It's 1862, and Charles Zimmers has just accepted his position as the new keeper at the Craggy Point Lighthouse on England's unforgiving northeastern coast. The retiring keeper, a man with a wild beard and wilder eyes, merely laughed when Charles asked about the living conditions. Living? You call this living? Ha! I haven't seen a fresh vegetable in 3 years, and I've named every rat in the tower. That one there is Lord Wellington. He's particularly fond of boot leather. The Board of Northern Lighthouses had painted quite the rosy picture during Charles's interview. A respectable position for a man of discipline, they said. Essential to maritime safety, they emphasized. Adequate compensation, they mumbled quickly. What they failed to mention was that adequate compensation meant a meager £65 per annum, which, considering the job required you to be on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, worked out to about a penny per hour. You could earn more sweeping chimneys, and at least then you'd occasionally see other human beings. The journey to Craggy Point itself should have been warning enough. As the supply boat battled waves tall as houses, the captain, a grizzled old sailor named Tobias, shouted over the wind. Last keeper went mad, they say. Started sending Morse code messages to mermaids. Ha ha ha. Charles didn't find this particularly amusing, especially when the boat nearly capsized twice before reaching the desolate rock upon which the lighthouse perched like an accusatory finger pointed at God. His new home was a stone tower roughly 120 feet tall, with living quarters that made a prison cell look spacious. The circular rooms, never more than 15 feet in diameter, meant that all furniture had to be custom-built to fit against curved walls. His bed was essentially a wedge of wood with a straw mattress. The first night on duty, Charles dutifully lit the oil lamps that powered the Fresnel lens. Victorian lighthouse technology was actually quite impressive. The lens could magnify the light to be visible up to 20 nautical miles away. What wasn't impressive was the fact that these lamps required constant attention. Every 4 hours, Charles needed to climb the 137 steps to the lantern room to trim the wicks and replenish the oil. At least I'll stay fit, he muttered to himself, already developing the habit of talking aloud that would soon become his primary form of entertainment. The board's manual instructed keepers to maintain a strict schedule. Rise at dawn, polish brass, check oil supplies, trim wicks, clean lens, log weather conditions, wind the clockwork mechanism that rotated the light. And God forbid the light should go out, that would mean certain dismissal, if not criminal charges should a shipwreck as a result. One particularly nasty night, as a storm raged so fierce it sent spray over the top of the lighthouse, Charles realized the true weight of his responsibility. Through the rain-lashed window, he spotted a merchant vessel struggling against the waves. Without the lighthouse beam, those sailors would certainly perish. So despite his exhaustion, despite the fact that he hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours, Charles continued his endless trudge up and down the spiral staircase to maintain the light. By morning, his hands were blistered from carrying hot oil, his lungs burned from smoke inhalation, and his legs felt like pudding. But the ship had survived. Did anyone thank him? Of course not. No one even knew he existed. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of lighthouse keeping. Supply boats came only once every 2 weeks, weather permitting, and in the Victorian era, the weather rarely permitted anything pleasant. During winter months, keepers could go 3 or 4 months without seeing another human face. Charles began keeping a journal, addressing entries to dear humanity, as if writing to a distant pen pal. Today I had a fascinating conversation with myself regarding the proper way to darn socks. I lost the argument. The boredom drove men to strange habits. Historical records show that one keeper at Scotland's Bell Rock Lighthouse spent 3 years carving an elaborate chess set from driftwood, only to realize he had no opponent to play against. Another keeper reportedly read the Bible 27 times consecutively, eventually convincing himself he was the prophet Ezekiel. When the supply boat finally arrived after a month of storms, Charles nearly wept at the sight of another human. The deliver man, A surly fellow named Bertram seemed less enthusiastic. "Got your provisions. Sign here." "Wait," Charles cried, grabbing Bertram's sleeve. "News? Any news from shore? A newspaper, perhaps? A letter?" Bertram shrugged him off. "Thames froze over. Queen's got a new hat. Some war somewhere. Oh, and they're thinking of automating lighthouses, making your job obsolete. Good day." And with that, Charles's human interaction quota was filled for the month. The Victorian era was obsessed with efficiency and technological advancement, and lighthouse keeping did not escape this enthusiasm. The Lighthouse Board constantly sent updated regulations and new equipment, expecting keepers to become instant experts despite having no training. One memorable directive instructed Charles to install a new fog bell mechanism that arrived in 37 separate pieces with instructions written by someone who clearly believed English was best expressed through incomprehensible technical jargon. After 3 days of frustration, he had something resembling the diagram, though it made a noise more like a dying cow than a bell. To whom it may concern, he wrote in his log, "The new fog notification device has been installed and functions perfectly, assuming its purpose is to summon demons from the underworld." Health issues plagued lighthouse keepers. The constant climbing of stairs led to chronic joint problems. The irregular sleep, often in 2 to 3 hour increments between lamp maintenance, caused extreme fatigue. The lack of fresh food resulted in scurvy, while the damp conditions fostered tuberculosis and rheumatism. Charles developed a persistent cough by his 3rd month. "I've named it Frederick," he told Lord Wellington, the rat who had indeed developed a taste for boot leather. "Frederick seems determined to evict my lungs from my chest cavity." Then there were the psychological effects. Victorian medicine had barely recognized mental health as a concept, but records show lighthouse keepers suffered disproportionately from melancholia, nervous disorders, and peculiarities of temperament, all Victorian euphemisms for what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, and the effects of isolation. During one particularly bad storm, when the waves crashed so high they broke the lantern room windows, Charles found himself laughing hysterically as he tried to keep the lamps lit while being drenched by seawater. "Just another day at the office," he shrieked to no one, his voice lost in the howling wind. The official logs that keepers were required to maintain reveal the gradual psychological deterioration. Charles's entries began professionally enough. January 15, 1862. Wind WSW, force 6. Barometer falling. 3 ships sighted, all passed safely. By month 6, they had evolved. June 23, 1862. Lord Wellington has staged a coup and declared himself Emperor of the Pantry. I have ceded all territory east of the stove. The seagulls, as usual, remain neutral parties in this conflict. Lighthouse keeping was one of the few Victorian occupations that occasionally employed women, though usually only as assistants to their keeper husbands. When Charles fell ill with a fever in his 2nd winter, the board sent temporary help in the form of Tabitha Briggs, the widowed daughter of a retired keeper. "They sent a woman?" Charles croaked from his sickbed. "Would you prefer the rats handle the light, Mr. Zimmers?" She replied crisply, already rolling up her sleeves. Tabitha proved remarkably adept, having grown up in lighthouses. She climbed the stairs without complaint, maintained the lamps with precision, and even fixed the fog bell so it no longer summoned underworld entities. "My father always said lighthouse keeping is 50% maintenance, 50% endurance, and 50% talking to yourself," she told him. "That's 150%, Charles pointed out. "Exactly. The job demands more than any person has to give." For 2 blessed weeks, Charles experienced the luxury of human conversation. They discussed books. They had both read Great Expectations 5 times due to limited library options, debated the merits of various biscuit recipes that could be made with limited ingredients, and speculated about whether Queen Victoria ever had to trim her own lamp wicks. When Charles recovered, Tabitha prepared to leave. "Back to civilization?" he asked enviously. She laughed. "I'm being transferred to Desolation Rock Lighthouse. It's further north, even more isolated. And apparently the previous keeper left after claiming the place was haunted by the ghost of a shipwrecked cabin boy who plays the bagpipes at midnight." Sounds like a step up in society. In lighthouse keeping, Mr. Zimmers, lateral moves are the best we can hope for. After she left, the silence seemed even more oppressive. Charles's 2-year contract stretched endlessly before him. The Victorian work ethic frowned upon breaking commitments, and leaving a lighthouse unmanned was actually illegal under maritime law. He was quite literally imprisoned by duty. On his 1-year anniversary at Craggy Point, Charles received an official letter from the board. Expecting perhaps recognition of his service, he opened it eagerly. "Dear Mr. Zimmers," it read, "due to budgetary considerations, your coal allowance is hereby reduced by 15%. Please adjust your heating needs accordingly. Additionally, please complete the enclosed 47-page inventory of all lighthouse property, including count of stairs, windows, and brass fixtures." Charles stared at the letter, then at Lord Wellington, who had recently been joined by Lady Wellington and several Wellington offspring. "You know," he told the Rat family, "I believe the board is under the impression that freezing to death while counting doorknobs is the lighthouse keeper's definition of career advancement." By the time his 2 years ended, Charles had developed a slight stoop from the stairs, had conversations with at least a dozen imaginary friends, and could predict weather changes by the ache in his joints more accurately than any barometer. His replacement arrived looking fresh-faced and optimistic, just as Charles had once been. As he handed over the logbooks and the sacred keys to the lamp room, Charles offered only one piece of advice. "The seagulls are spies, the rats are revolutionaries, and if you ever hear yourself reciting poetry to the waves, it's already too late for you." The young man laughed nervously. Charles took one last look at Craggy Point Lighthouse as the supply boat pulled away. Despite everything, the isolation, the drudgery, the madness-inducing responsibility, he felt an unexpected pang of loss. Perhaps that was the final cruel joke of lighthouse keeping. After it nearly broke you, you somehow missed it. 2 months later, now working as a clerk in a reasonably dry, reasonably warm counting house in Newcastle, Charles received a peculiar package. Inside was a crudely carved wooden rat, along with a note in unfamiliar handwriting. "Mr. Zimmers, Lord Wellington sends his regards. The revolution was successful. He now controls 2 shelves and the entirety of the matchbox supply. I believe I have developed a new form of communication with the mermaids. The seagulls have confirmed my suspicions about the moon. All is well at Craggy Point." Your successor Charles placed the wooden rat on his desk and returned to his columns of numbers, occasionally glancing up at his souvenir from the lighthouse. At least now, when he talked to himself, there were other people around to confirm he was doing it. And that, perhaps, was the true irony of Victorian lighthouse keeping. It was a profession essential to saving countless lives at sea, performed by individuals whose own lives were considered entirely expendable, men and women who kept others from drowning while slowly drowning in isolation themselves. As the Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson never wrote but should have, "The light may shine for 20 miles, but the keeper's soul remains in darkness, except every 4 hours when he burns his fingers on the bloody lamp again."